I'm going to talk today about the cost of inaction on policy for forest conservation and restoration. What does it cost society to not make a decision to do something that is going to help us in the long run and ensure that ecosystems are conserved and the benefits for humanity are ensured in the long term? I'm going to start this talk looking at a framework for evaluation that has been developed since say, about the 1990s, soon after ECO 92 in Rio de Janeiro, where there was a lot of concern for how you could measure effectively the benefits from making the right decisions to lead you in a more sustainable direction in the kind of policies that are adopted by countries, parties to these agreements, or even at different levels of governance. So the kind of framework that was developed at that time, which is called the Pressure State Response Framework, PSR, not to be confused with PES, has to do with the pressures that are brought to bear by human activities through economic activities such as energy use, transportation, industrial activity, agriculture, whatever, how those pressures affect the state variables, the state of the environment in terms of the quality of the air, the quality of water, the amount of water that is available, the amount of land that is available for arable purposes and that is still fertile, and other natural resources that may be under threat because of over-extraction, over-use, such as fisheries. How are the pressures of society on nature in terms of the services and benefits that are provided by nature affecting the long-term productivity of those resources? How does society respond to that, having the information adequately provided to governors, to community groups, and others who are concerned about how these resources are being affected by economic activities? What kinds of decisions can be made? What kinds of incentives can be structured that can make the economic activities more amenable to the threats that are being borne by nature? How to reduce those pressures through economic instruments, through command and control instruments, through legal tools, whatever. What kinds of international agreements can be developed that can ensure that different countries deal with the global problems in a measured fashion? So this kind of framework has been used most recently in a study that was done looking at the 2010 biodiversity goals that were set as a part of the global agreements on biodiversity and ecosystem services that look at this from a pressure state response kind of framework. How does the baseline situation that is expected for growth in population and economic activity and how do international policies affect changes that are underway in terms of the use of land, in terms of the increase in global climate, in terms of global warming, in terms of pollution, water use, other variables that are of great importance to humanity? How are these things projected to be affected by the kind of situation that is seen as a business as usual in terms of the change in the biodiversity stocks and in the ecosystem functions, and how these will then yield changes in ecosystem services and a change adding the valuation aspect in economic value associated with the costs of not taking the right decisions at the right time. This study that was done by Den Brink and others for the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity Project for the European Union back in 2008 generated some numbers that were pretty impressive in terms of the kinds of costs that we could have for not taking the right decisions at the right time, for leaving things to later, Politicians tend to procrastinate if it's something that's not going to yield them votes in the short term. But some of these things, if you don't act on them pretty early, they're going to come back at you, and they might even bite you during the term in office. So we certainly hope that people will, politicians and others will reflect on the impact of environmental costs during the time in which they are responsible for governing these resources. What has been developed as a result of these studies is what's called a cost of policy inaction, the cost of not doing the right thing at the right time, valuation process, a process of valuing what the costs are that are associated with not taking the right decisions at the right time. So the procedure that was undertaken for this study that was done in the European Union is to provide estimates of the future loss of environmental capital and services that would not be available if you let things go according to the same rate of loss that was estimated according to the reference point, a baseline. And the reference point that was used could be a current stock of environmental capital or some definition of prior environmental capital stock, which might have been existing prior to the moment at which was being projected. The change was projected then against this defined reference point and then translated into an economic assessment recognizing the total economic value, the use and non-use components of economic value, combining qualitative, physical, and monetary estimates. It's not just money estimates, but we're trying to get at dollar figures that will shake the boots of the politicians enough for them to pay attention. The qualitative and physical aspects of environmental damage are necessary in order to arrive at a monetary estimate. You cannot estimate something that you don't have any kind of qualitative information about. But there does require making this other leap of reasoning to arrive at measurements that can be valued in economic terms. So what was done there in terms of valuation was to try to measure the loss in value terms of the potential benefits from biodiversity ecosystem services in the future if those goals that were set by the CDB were not met. So we can see in this diagram that from looking at the period from 2000 to the year 2050, which was the projection period that they adopted, with increasing GDP that was predicted in that period, if you valued the losses from biodiversity and ecosystem services that would not be obtained at the rate of growth that had been estimated, you would actually have a decline in GDP at some point. So sometime between 2020 and 2050, you would actually have a curve that would be downward sloping instead of upward sloping, while population continues to increase. But there could be a collapse in population that could also be affected by the exposure to disease vectors, that could be affected by availability of food, all of the Malthusian notions that had been well presented since the 18th century by Thomas Malthus are still upon us today. In valuation terms themselves, the cost of the ecosystem service loss up to 2050 was measured in terms of current euro values in the billions. It was the total value of looking at all of the different types of ecosystems that would be affected by the continued loss in biodiversity and ecosystem services and the benefits that they bring to humanity. The total value that they arrived at was nearly 14 trillion euros. That would be over a long period of time, but even that little bit would have a significant effect on GDP loss. So you would have an actual decline of between 6 and 7% in GDP at the fuller estimation, and there's a partial estimation in which it would be quite a bit lower. But if you went to the full estimation of all of the benefits that could be lost over this time period, we're talking about a significant loss in GDP that would have been measurable had there been inclusion of the biodiversity losses in that cost.